This is Encounters with Life. I'm Sean Abigail, your host. Ronald Reagan knew how to handle the Russians, and Donald Trump doesn't. Let me go back in time a little bit, though. I was born just a few years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. I grew up during that 35-year period known as the Cold War. And every morning, every evening, I knew full well that the missiles could fly. I knew that we lived under the specter of nuclear war. And there was some times when things were tight, the whole situation in the world was chaotic and dangerous. About half a generation before me, maybe 10 years before me, school children used to practice jumping under their desks in case there was a missile attack. And I remember as a kid, out on a summer day and hearing the air raid sirens go off. What a terrible thing that was. I didn't know whether that was just a drill, whether it was practice, whether it was an accident, or whether the missiles were flying. And I remember thinking, well, I guess I'll know in about 30 minutes whether it was real or not. And of course it wasn't. I don't know what it was, why they had the air raid sirens go off, but there were air raid sirens all over my city, and I could hear them. Well, all of that changed when Ronald Reagan came along, and he brought the Cold War to an end. And he did it using money and using force. He knew full well to stand up to the Russians. And so, for instance, when using Cuban proxies, they took over the island of Grenada in the Caribbean, Reagan didn't put up with it, and he invaded Grenada with a large military force. Also, when the Solidarity Union was in Poland, and there was talk of martial law, there was talk of the Russians invading, Reagan did something unprecedented. He worked with Margaret Thatcher and with Pope John Paul II to basically bring down the Polish government and to keep the Russians out. At that point in time, I think it was unprecedented for a foreigner, certainly unprecedented for a pope, but Pope John Paul II was getting satellite photos from American keyhole satellites brought over to him and shown to him what was happening. And together they brought down the Russians. The second thing they did to bring down the Russians, besides being strong, was they outspent them. They crushed their economy. And basically, the Americans and the Russians were just playing catch up with each other on military spending. And Reagan said to himself, well, my economy is half again as large as the Russians. I can outspend them. And he did. And Caspar Weinberger, who had been known as a cost-cutting bureaucrat in the, I think it was Department of Health and Human Services, I'm not sure, when he came in as defense secretary, basically they started calling him capitulating because he just started scooping out more and more money for defense spending. And they outspent the Russians. The Russians simply couldn't keep up. So Reagan knew how to handle the Russians. Be tough, be smart. And the Russians respect that. They actually respect that. And they will despise anyone who tries to be weak, tries to negotiate. No, they respect toughness, and they will back down. Well, we are seeing something unprecedented. A Republican leader, not Ronald Reagan, definitely not Ronald Reagan, Republican leader Donald Trump seems to be using the Russian talking points, seems to be siding with the Russians in Ukraine, in Europe, and so on. I think Ronald Reagan must be turning over in his grave that such a thing is happening. If only, I say to myself, maybe this is some sort of master plan that Donald Trump has to bring the Russians along and then pull the rug out from underneath their feet or whatever. But I don't think so, because what I'm seeing from Donald Trump, what I'm seeing from his cabinet, so on, is they seem to have very little interest in standing up to the Russians, and they are giving the Russians everything that the Russians want. It disturbs me. It hurts me. I'm confused, and I am worried by this. So what we need is for the American president to do a little bit more of a Ronald Reagan impersonation and to stand up the Russians? Well, as always, I'm interested in your opinions. Is this something that you think I'm just crazy? Oh, they have nuclear weapons. Well, they had a lot of nuclear weapons back when Reagan was the leader, and Reagan still stood up to them. But what's your opinion? And as always, please like and subscribe to my video if you want to see more content. I'm Sean Abigail. That's Encounters with Life.